Well, and behind the monitor over there, we're going to have a bit of an old-time religion today, and he looked a little bit nervous. But that's what I want to do today, is to talk a little bit about old-time religion, because we're going to be looking at the relationships between missionaries and Aborigines this week, and we actually cannot understand this unless we have some sense of where the missionaries were coming from. And of course we also always need to think about where Aboriginal people are coming from. So today I want to talk to you about, not quite old-time religion in a sense, but I want to talk to you about evangelicalism, and for us to understand this great burst of energy that came from the late 18th century, early 19th century, which really changed the political landscape in many ways. Led to a whole new set of social movements, a whole new burst of energy, and I think a whole new emphasis to European colonialism that had been going on for some time, but it had a much more religious element to it after this. So I want to talk firstly about what people have called as the excuse me, I think I went too far. As the evangelical revival. And where did that come from? Well, the main church, of course, in England that dominated the landscape politically, socially and religiously was the Church of England. But the Church of England, the state church, the Church of the King, was in decline by the 18th century. It had become religiously slack and had got caught up with the world, if you like. Partly this was because the rise of the landowning class that I've talked about before, the gentry, saw the church as a field for its own ends and patronage, because as I've reminded you, only the firstborn son gained the land, and the others had to be found a place in the world by the family. And one of those ideal places, of course, was the Church of England, because if you could buy your way into a living in the church, which then produced an income from its lands and its parishes, parish income, so that your second or third son would be set up for life as a pastor in the Anglican Church. And so livings were bought by those with money. And this led to a church that became less interested in the business of religion and more about status and economic power. So the church, not in every case, but in many cases, there were people in the parishes of the Anglican Church who were parsons more interested in worldly things, and people talked about the hunting parsons of the 18th century, men who were more interested in those sort of things. So the church was, in that sense, being drawn into the hierarchical power structure of society, and it was being corrupted, if you like, by the secular world. And so the sort of typical hunting parson tended to be less interested in church work, so he held less services. He often would get curates to run the service for him, or if he did run the service, he might be inclined to read out of a book of sermons, word for word, nothing that he put any work in. He just bought a book, and he had this book, he trotted it out every Sunday, he had to give a sermon, and he just read it out. So it was unemotional and uninteresting to many people. And the whole church was dominated by the hierarchical structure, because in the church, in the most important position, probably in a high pew, sometimes with screens around it, would be the large landowner of the area. And he would be the person who was in, the power play of that area with the parson. And so the church was focused very much on the rich, not the poor. And the poor people were way up the back in the poor seats. Most people rented a seat in the church, so the people that were best well off had the seats closest to the front, near the action. So the church had become very Erastian. This was following a Swiss theologian who wrote about these matters. And an Erastian church is when the state is placed above the church, and it's state power that's most interesting. So that the whole view of religion was, in the Anglican Church, of a very distant and unemotional God. And a lot of clergymen had the view that God was like a great clockmaker who had created the world, shaped it, and then set it in motion and then just sat back. So there was no engagement by the church with a God that was active and religious. Now, into this 18th century church was born a man called John Wesley. He was born in 1703, and he was the 15th of 19 children, the burden carried by his mother Susanna, although his father Samuel, who was a Church of England clergyman, had something to do with that as well. Now, he's had forebears who were nonconformists, and nonconformists who are Protestants who are outside the established church. People like the Unitarians and the Congregationalists were very old nonconformist churches. That is, they didn't conform to the established church. They were allowed to worship, but they didn't have the same rights. So you couldn't become, for instance, a member of the government or the public servants if you were a nonconformist, and certainly you couldn't if you were a Catholic. So Wesley had both of these traditions in his family. The established church, of which his father was a member, and the dissenters, the nonconformist Protestants. Now, Wesley went to Oxford in 1720, and he went through theological school and was ordained. And while he was at Oxford, he was very sort of an intense young man, very religious, and he used to gather for private Bible study with a few other intense young men at Oxford, and they were called by their fellows the Methodists. This was a derisive term because they were so Methodistic about the way they studied the Bible and went through their daily life. So they were derisively called the Methodists, and that was a term that Wesley was later to embrace and turn it in against others and make a glory out of the term Methodist. Well, the young Wesley went to Georgia, and when he was in Georgia in the US, he got mixed up with the group of Moravians, who were German Protestants who were very interested in missionizing, and they were there to work amongst the Native Americans. They were a very strict Protestant German sect, rigorous in their religious practice, and, as I said, very fervent missionaries. And while he was there, he started to reassess where he was in terms of his own religiosity. He goes back to London, and while he's at a prayer meeting in London, he writes in his journal that he felt strangely warmed and moved by what he was hearing and how he was reacting to it. And this really led to a further spiritual crisis and a conversion experience to a new way of thinking about religion. And this was increased by meeting up with a man called Whitefield. Now, George Whitefield was a man who took his preaching into the fields. He didn't believe you needed a church and its walls to preach and talk about the Word of God. He just went out into the fields. So he spoke to the lower orders of English society. Wesley met him and was very impressed by this field preaching. So that together they went and held great meetings talking about religion to just anyone who had come along. And Wesley started to develop his own meetings methods. Instead of just a church service on Sunday, he got people together on Wednesday nights, which he called classes, class meetings. And at these class meetings, people started to express themselves in new ways. They would talk about their religious feelings, talk about the state of their religious health in the previous week, and sometimes people would start raving, and sometimes they'd fall on the ground and they'd start yelling out and they'd start to say, I am saved, I am changed, and they would be just yelling out. Now, this is not how religion was practiced at the time. You know, religion in the Anglican Church was all following a format, a ritual, and it was all controlled up the front. But here in his class meetings, everything was bursting out. And these people were falling down and expressing new feelings and letting it out in the most ungentlemanly-like way, a robust manner, yelling, etc., etc. So this was something new. And then Wesley started to influence people to go out and preach. And so a new movement came of having lay preachers. These people that are not ordained by the church, not sanctioned by the church, but just someone like you or I in the audience who feels moved to go out and get on a street corner in the field and start talking about religion. So Wesley then was drawn into the open air, and he was drawn to the people who collected there, the working classes of England and the poor. And here you see him in the midst of Newgate Prison. Now, he hasn't got a great reception there because there's a lot of sort of disinterest in what he's saying, a lot of joking and laughing and pointing, but there are perhaps a few people listening, and that's all he depended on, a few people listening in these very tough situations. So Wesley never ceased to become an Anglican, but he did ordain ministers as Methodists who went to North America. And eventually, after his death, the Methodist Church was formed and then split in many ways. There were Uniting Methodists and Primitive Methodists, etc. But there was a great burst of activity. Now, what did these people have in common? Well, the evangelical principles had about 5 things. One of them was the doctrine of the new birth. Now, Wesley said it wasn't good enough to be baptised as you were in the Anglican Church at the age of 6 or 9 months, baptised into the church, because it meant nothing. And so he said that the only way you could enter church fellowship was to have a conversion experience. That, as I've said, these were often very emotional, very heartfelt, and they came from the individual. So that was the only conversion that he and the other Methodists recognised as worthwhile. Secondly, it was crucicentric theology, that is, Christ-centred. So these people were not stressing Jehovah of the Old Testament. They weren't talking about intermediaries like the Virgin Mary who interceded for people with God. They believed that you had to have a direct relationship with God, and particularly they stressed Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross. So the story of Calvary was central to them. And they would say things like, I believe because Jesus did this for me. It was a very personal relationship they had. And it was based also on the notion of the Bible. And the Bible was central to Protestantism after the Reformation, but also it was central especially to the evangelicals, because they said that only by reading the Word of God could you make up your mind about having a conversion, and therefore they stressed the individual and reading. And that's why the Methodists were very much behind the working classes learning to read. They started the Sunday school movement, which at the first was all about teaching young kids to read. So then they had access to the Word of God. The other thing about them were evangelicals were messianic. And by that we mean that they believed in the missionary experience. That it wasn't good enough to save yourself. If you had the Word, the good Word, you had to spread it to others. And this led to an enormous drive from these churches that believed they had the Word they had to share. And the last, of course, was salvation by faith. At the Reformation, Protestantism went 2 ways. One was Luther, who said that salvation was by faith alone, and Calvin, who said good works. So if you built an orphanage, you might get into heaven, or you spread your money around, you could get into heaven. But Luther said no, the only way to enter the kingdom of God was to have faith. And if you had faith, you would. So they are faith-based religions, and believing that they have to spread it to everyone else. So let's look at the evangelical influence. Methodist churches are forming. Evangelicalism is transforming the Church of England. There's a revolution from in, and that was what Wesley was doing. He was changing the church from within. Others were changing it from without. And so there's a great spreading of this influence, and it goes into a whole range of ways. One of them was the time-work discipline and the views that Wesley had on this. Wesley thought that God gave you time and therefore you should use it wisely. So Wesley himself rose at 4 a.m. every day, and he kept a diary of what he did every hour of the day to make sure every hour was used wisely. And he believed, and others, that you honoured God through hard work. And so, you focused yourself through the day, you worked hard, and that was then going to be a truly Christian life. So he kept a diary, and many others did too. William Wilberforce, and there's currently a movie showing about Wilberforce's role in the slave thing. Wilberforce kept a diary every day once he'd had a conversion experience, and he ruled up several columns. One was for devotion, one was for study, one was for work, eating and sleeping. So the whole day was to be rigorously organised. And I hope that you'll go away and get your own diaries and organise your lives in a similar fashion. It's probably very, very sensible in a way. It doesn't slip away, and that's what they believe. You don't let everything slip away. Everything's got to be for a purpose and focused. And of course this spills over to those evangelicals that run factories, start to try and get their workers to act in the same way. And they bring in things like clocks into the factory, and they start Bundy systems. There was a Bundy system in factories by the 1780s, and employers would it was a bit like a workplace agreement, that you had a whole set of rules about when you came to work, how much break you had. So they were regularising work in the same way as they regularised their life. The other thing was Sabbatarianism, which was, of course, the observance of the Lord's Day. In the Christian practice Sunday, in the Jewish tradition Saturday. And so there was a whole shift in the way society observed Sunday. George III, the king, stopped holding Sunday dinners at the court. There was a Sunday Observance Society formed in 1775, and that was to try and make the practice of Sunday observance more rigorous. So to try and end amusements, to try and stop blood sports and other games being played on Sunday. And the Bishop of London was such an enthusiast for Sabbath observance that he used to get the curtain brought down at the theatre at 12 o'clock. Didn't matter if the show hadn't ended, the curtain came down and everything stopped. So, it was put in very rigorously by these people. And there was a whole series of moral or anti-vice campaigns, efforts to get greater public decorum, end swearing in public. Publications were censored for the first time in the early 19th century, and there was an attempt to get people to regularise their drinking through temperance movements or total abstinence movements to stop drinking altogether or to get people to moderate it. And together with that, a whole end or attempt to end blood sports at this time, because they were seen as unseemly, they were seen to be against good feelings. But it went to extremes, like some evangelicals tried to censor the word bitch and to include instead mother mastiff, or another name for a mother dog, because bitch was seen to be unseemly. And the word pregnant emerged instead of big with child. And there was a bloke called Thomas Bowdler who was so keen that he brought out his own editions of Shakespeare to expurgate all the naughty things in the Shakespeare edition. So there was a family Shakespeare published in about 1807, and he even brought out a family version of the Bible, because there's quite a lot of begatting in some parts of the Bible, and it goes on for pages about all that begatting. That is copulation and whatever. So this wasn't to be mentioned. So he brought out a version of the Bible that had asterisks on the approved pages. So people tended to go to the unapproved pages. That was sending the signals of that. So evangelicals, as I said, started to influence churches, and they went into all social ranks, but particularly into the emerging middle class, and created many social movements. And these people were driven by the view, as psychologists would call them, internals, that they believe that if you do the right thing internally, you can change the world. You can shape the world by the power of your vision, by your focus and your drive. So I guess only the internals will go away and make those diaries up with 5 columns, and the externals amongst us will let that ride. But they were important in a whole range of social movements. The factory legislation of the 1820s, 30s and 40s, which reined in the worst of industrial exploitation, was coming from the evangelicals. Wilberforce, for instance, was behind the efforts to end child labour in the mines and other areas. And the women's suffrage movement, that doesn't triumph till the end of the century, emerges from the evangelicals, who argue that women are the better half, and if the vote is given to women, then political life and the whole of society will be uplifted by this injection of the woman's influence. And of course this was led by Queen Victoria being seen as the great Christian mother of the 19th century, the ideal of motherhood and of true virtue, and of creating the Christian home. So evangelical slides into ideas of humanitarianism and benevolence. And you can see that in the charity work they do. So not all of them were strictly internal. Some of them believed if you could create better social environment, people would be better. And so they start to try and do charity work, and a lot of the evangelicals get involved in prison reform. Howard and Elizabeth Fry, John Howard and Elizabeth Fry, are trying to reform the nature of prisons, make them more orderly, more organised, to regulate them by separating out criminals from more first offenders, and young offenders from old offenders, that sort of thing. So trying to regularise things. And there became a view that the true human was a person of sensibility. A man of feeling was the true evangelical, who did things like end blood sports, protect animals, etc. So this whole movement then led to all sweeping changes through society, but of course led to the creation of missionary societies, like the London Missionary Society in 1795, the Church Missionary Society in 1799. So at the turn of the century, all these missions are getting regularised. The Methodists have their own by about 1818. Now, I suppose the epitome of this whole movement is the Clapham sect, and they're probably worth talking about because they were the ones that led the end of slavery, the anti-slavery movement, over 2 generations. This movement emerged in the 1780s, and of course this year we're celebrating 200 years of one of their great victories in 1807. Now in the 1780s, Thomas Clarkson wrote a paper. He was, I think, Oxford or Cambridge. He wrote a paper, at Cambridge he was, and he wrote a paper asking the question, is it lawful to make slaves of others against their will. And so convinced was he by his writing and his research that he decided to write another pamphlet called What Can I Do? And so he had translated his anti-slavery academic interest into one of a mission. He met Granville Sharp, who had been involved in earlier anti-slave campaigns, and together they hooked up with a very important group in society, the Quakers, another Protestant sect of great power in the sense of being focused and directive, a small group, but they created an enormous amount of energy, and they created an abolition society. And then they sought a public figure, and they, of course, found William Wilberforce, which the film on at the moment is about. Wilberforce was on a continental tour. He was a gentleman, a rather wealthy man. He was doing the tour of Europe, as people did at that stage in the mid-1780s. And he started to read the New Testament while he was on that tour of Europe, and he experiences a religious conversion, a new birth, if you like, that Wesley was talking about. He meets Clarkson, and together they form a lobby group which came to be called the Clapham Sect. This was made up of evangelicals, gentry, people of substance, people with connections, and it connected in with some people who had West Indian experience, so direct experience of the slave trade in the West Indies, the sugar plantations. That was James Stephens. There was also other clergymen, Reverend Henry and Reverend Venn, and Zachary Macaulay, who knew all about the facts and figures, because they generated one of the most long-sustained and important propaganda campaigns that we've ever seen. Really, for 2 generations, they sustained the assault on one of the most vested interests of the British Empire, and that was the holding and trading in slaves and the using of the labour of others for nothing. And so they formed what became known as the Clapham Sect, because they met at Henry Thornton's house, called Clapham House in London, and they would meet on a weekend. They'd have breakfast together, lunch, dinner, they'd talk, they'd plan, and so close did they get that a lot of those families intermarried, and there was a second generation of the Clapham Sect ready to keep the fight going in the 1820s. Now, it was a massive task, as I said, because it was a huge vested interest. Half of the slave trade was done in English ships, and English ports sustained those ships. So there's a great sort of ripple effect of all the jobs, the shipbuilding, all the ship fitting industries, the sailors, etc. Half of the British fleet depended upon the slave trade. And so people also argued that the British naval strength depended on the slave trade, because all that training, all that shipbuilding was making the British Navy the greatest in the world. But the Clapham Sect took on this great lobby, and William Wilberforce entered Parliament in 1789. He started to talk, and I think the only thing about the film, which I haven't seen, it seems to be the film suggests it's a one-man band, and the anti-slavery campaign certainly was not a one-man band. There were people touring as lecturers, there were people forming local committees, there were people meeting every weekend plotting and planning. Wedgwood, the potter, gave his time, and he made a beautiful cameo of the face of a slave with the legend under it, "Am I not a man? Am I not your brother?" And so there were mugs, there were medallions, everything was used to sway people's opinion. And this whole anti-slavery movement filtered out into the Sunday school movement, the religious writings of the time, the religious press of the time, the Bible Society. All these would have been used also to talk about the anti-slavery movement. And eventually, in 1807, and that's what we're celebrating this year, there was an end of British shipping being involved in the slave trade. But of course, the slave use itself still continued in the West Indies. And that was the next fight to be fought. And Buxton, who is pictured here, took over the cause in about 1820 from Wilberforce, and he was the one that pushed on until finally in 1833 slavery was ended in the West Indies, although it took 5 years because they had this good deal. They were against such a vested interest. The slaves were freed, but then they said, well, you actually have to go and work for your master for another 5 years, but you're an apprentice, and then you'll become a free person after that. So there was this transition arrangement that had to be brokered. Such was the power of the slave owners. But that was engineered by Buxton. So you can see that, the people that we're talking about, the missionaries, are coming out of a huge, powerful tradition that truly believes in what it's doing. So let's talk about who they sent to Australia. And most of the missions, as you can see in this map, most of the missions started in southeast Australia, Victoria in particular, New South Wales, and a few in other parts around the Swan River, now Perth, and up around Brisbane. Now, the missionaries that were sent to Australia were a particular sort of people, and they were said to be godly mechanics. Mechanic meaning not quite someone that fixes a car, but that was an artisan, someone who worked with their hands, with machinery, etc., etc. Now, it was seen that these people would have useful skills for pioneering, because missionaries also had to be pioneers, and they had to build things, they had to get things going from scratch. So you had to have someone who could do this work, who knew how to do it and could do it. The other reason, I think, was a class-based one, that the people in the missionary societies back home reasoned that you had to have someone who was intelligible to a savage. And if you had someone who was too highfalutin, too high-born, or too well-schooled in the theology of Christology, then they wouldn't get through to the savage. So in fact, this view was based upon a class view of the mechanics, and also a racial view of Aborigines as savage people who couldn't understand very much. And one man even wrote that an educated man would be wasted. A man of liberal education never could stoop to make use of such low, not to say absurd, imagery as would be necessary to convey his ideas to them. So we can see that some of the people who first came, and we'll come across some of them in our reading this week, one of them was William Watson. He was a school teacher. And the London Missionary Society didn't want to ordain him before he came because they thought it was unnecessary. He just had to be a lay preacher to talk to savages. Watson objected to this, and eventually he was made a catechist, and then later he was made an ordained minister, but only for the mission field. So they had that proviso on him. Reverend Tuckfield, who was out near Colac Way in a mission called Buntingdale in the late 1830s into the 1840s, he had no formal training at all, except for just a short course at a mission college. Threlkeld, who we've seen on our videos, making some very passionate statements about the frontier, he was a brush maker and also an actor, which you might imagine from his very beautiful writing and delivery. And so it was the educated people that were saved for the China missions and the Indian missions, because these were seen to be higher societies, higher civilizations, and therefore you had to have educated people to deal with them. Now, of course, the problem of having godless mechanics was that these people didn't have strong educated backgrounds, so they often were not very inquisitive about other cultures. They had perhaps limited horizons. They hadn't been broadened by reading about other cultures, other people. And I think they had little equipment, education equipment, to deal with a society that was so different. and quite a few were quite moralistic in their views. And probably them being mechanics helps explain in a way how they fitted or didn't fit into colonial society. They, I think, came with a status anxiety. They were at the low down in their own society, and when they met Aboriginal people, they tended to be a bit more sort of rigorous towards them, a bit more judgmental of Aboriginal people, probably because they are insecure in their own status, and so they put themselves very much above the Aborigines and sometimes dismissed them as possibly worthless. Now, what they were supposed to be doing, these godly mechanics, when they got here, was to fulfil the civilising mission. And there was at times a debate, how should you do this? Should you, in fact, civilise people and then Christianise them, or should you do it the other way around? And there were different people in the missionary societies held one view or the other, but in practice on the ground, they tended to do both at once. They certainly had to try and to stop Aboriginal people from moving around so they could start to talk with them and to conduct services. So they were trying to civilise in that way to make them sedentary and into farmers, but they're also very quickly trying to translate the Bible, trying to talk to them about God. But of course, that was a very difficult enterprise. How do you talk to someone about quite sophisticated theological concepts when you're not communicating very well language-wise, and often in a pidgin language that can't sustain sophisticated ideas? So they had a very tough row to hoe. Now, just to talk about a couple of people in particular, you had Joseph Hant, who is in the Wellington Valley, and we're going to meet him in our reading this week. Well, I hope we already have met him in our reading this week, because we're talking about it in a few hours. But Hant came from the German states, born in the 1790s, and he was a tailor by profession. He went to the Basel Missionary Institute, which meant he didn't get a theological education, but more a low-level missionary preacher education. First of all, he went to Africa with the Church Missionary Society, actually to Liberia, where a lot of the freed slaves from the United States had been settled. And they went into a very difficult situation, into the wilderness, and all his colleagues died, and he was advised to go home. And when he got home, he came under some sort of cloud of shame that he'd given up. You're supposed to stick it out no matter what. And then he gets sent to New South Wales, which is probably by way of punishment, I suspect, rather than much else. He arrived in Sydney, he looked around, he decided to get married, and often missionaries do this. You actually need a wife before you can go out and confront the missionary situation. And he was at the Wellington Valley for some years before moving to Moreton Bay, to Sydney, finally settling in Geelong in 1852 and dying when he was about 70 in poor circumstances in the 1860s. Now, he was certainly a humble artisan, and he found learning Aboriginal languages extremely difficult. He would have had to learn anyway from German, learning English, and that was the thing. A lot of the missionaries that came to Australia were from Germany, particularly the Moravians, and they had the double handicap of having to learn English to work effectively in colonial society, but also trying to learn an Aboriginal language. So Hant, I think, struggled with the whole situation of the language problem, and he also, I think, was fairly narrow in his views. He was no great ethnographer in having the imagination to observe another culture and to write about it. Reverend Threlkeld also was a humble artisan. In a way, he was self-educated. He was, as I said, a brush maker, then actor. And he had a conversion experience and joined the London Missionary Society, and eventually in 1826 found his way to Newcastle, where he formed a mission at Lake Wellington, north of Newcastle. Now, Threlfall, a very interesting person, I think, because he's one of the missionaries that is always oppositional to colonial society, in the sense he becomes a great critic of what's happening on the frontier. And no matter what you think of missionaries in some sense, many of them became advocates for Aboriginal people. And certainly Threlkeld does. He prepares dossiers about what's going on the frontier, and he sends them off to the governor. He writes reports. He did so after the Major Nunn expedition, from what he'd heard, what people had told him, and he claimed, probably in an exaggerated way, that 500 people had been killed over several years in the Liverpool Plains area. Certainly he felt none had been responsible for 200 to 300 deaths. But he had overall a very clear idea of what was going on, and he wrote this about colonisation. We have placed ourselves in a position that has compelled the Aborigines to become our neighbours, and we have worked ill towards our neighbours because we, the many, dispossess the few blacks of their rights of birth, which convey to them a certain district in which they seek and obtain their means of subsistence. Our might deprives them of this right. Without remuneration, and immigration so beneficial to us as a colony in increasing our population decreases in incalculable ratio our neighbours as a people, by taking away the common hereditary privileges which they have possessed since time immemorial. So he had a very clear idea about the colonisation process. Another of these early evangelicals worth talking about, and that's a picture of Threlkeld and part of that quotation that I read out to you. Another one was George Augustus Robinson, who was certainly an evangelical, a man of feeling. He was an artisan who went to Hobart in the 1820s. He became a builder, and he was a strong self-improver, not only an evangelical, but believed in getting ahead in the world, joining the right societies, the Mechanics Institute, learning to improve yourself, and then putting it to practice. But after being in Hobart for a few years, he takes a job as the Bruny Island storekeeper. And I don't know whether his finances weren't doing particularly well in Hobart, or he just saw that this is an important thing to do. And at Bruny Island, he actually came up with his own plan for the Aborigines, which was a plan for their protection. He began some important journeys across the southern part of Tasmania, guided by Aboriginal guides, particularly Truganini, who he became close to. And then he became known as the Conciliator, and that's a famous painting of him as the Conciliator. And eventually he forges the plan to take them to Flinders Island to convince Aboriginal people to move off Tasmania. And of course he's getting them out of the way of settlement, but clearing the way for settlement. And then he takes them to Flinders Island, where most of them perish. He then moves to the southern coast, Victoria, and becomes the chief protector of the Aborigines. Now it's important to see where that protectorate idea came from. Back in London, Buxton, after he'd won the freedom of the slaves in the West Indies, he decided to look for other evils to defeat. And he looked at the position of Indigenous people in the empires. He engineered a House of Commons Select Committee, because by then the evangelicals were in control of Parliament. Such were their numbers. That's how they'd won the battle against slavery, and he engineered this select committee into Indigenous people. and took 2 years of evidence from colonial administrators, from clergymen. They even took evidence from Hottentot chiefs that were brought over from the Cape Colony to give evidence about how the British Empire was going. Now, Buxton wrote the report with Reverend Philip, and their report was a damning one. They said colonisation was an evil. Instead of a cause for good, the British Empire was degrading Indigenous peoples around the world. And they condemned it roundly, and they said this has to change. They even said that Aboriginal land rights were being ignored. And so it was quite a radical document put by these evangelicals. They talked for the first time about Aboriginal land rights or native title. And they argued that something has to be done because Indigenous people are decaying, and that what they wanted was for the British Empire to become a good empire. And this was to be done by Christianising, bringing Christianity. And of course, this was the great gift the evangelicals offering the world. They had the truth. They had the truth about salvation. There was no greater gift that could be brought to people. So to bring Christianity to these people, to bring education, and that is civilisation, and to protect them through things like labour contracts, reserves, etc. So they saw it as a sacred duty to bring equity and justice to the empire. And so what they do achieve is to create a Port Phillip Protectorate. It's the only one in Australia that's so formed, and for a while it does play, I think, a role in making the frontier a little bit more of a controlled and regulated place. Because the Port Phillip Protectorate, led by George Augustus Robinson, has 5 protectors whose role is to be intermediaries between settlers and Aborigines, to report injustices and outrages against Aboriginal people, which they did regularly to the government. And I think they made a difference in that settlers had to be more circumspect about what they did, and there were less outrages of the type of Mile Creek that we looked at last week. But the settlers, of course, hated the protectorate. They thought it was a waste of money, and it was a waste of their money because they were made to pay for it out of the Colonial Land Fund. And eventually, after 10 years, they forced the end of the Aboriginal Protectorate in 1848. But it's interesting just to look at the life of one of those protectors, James Dredge, I think, to try and understand these evangelicals again. Dredge underwent Methodist conversion back in England when he was aged 21 in 1817. He wrote in his religious diary, which we still have, "Oh, how thankful I ought to be that I am not a lost soul in hell," he wrote. And from that moment on, he felt saved, but he wanted to do something about it. How could he best serve God? So he decided, after hearing Jabez Bunting, who was a great leading light in the Methodist Missionary Society, he heard him preach, and he went home and wrote in his diary. He was on fire and passionate. He said, "May heathenism and idolatry soon fall before the face of truth, and may the light of revelation, accompanied with a divine energy, soon chase iniquity from the face of the earth." So from that moment, he wanted to be a missionary. And then started a 20-year struggle to become a missionary. Because he went along to the Missionary Society and they said, "Well, you don't have any experience. Go and become a school teacher. You need skills and you need experience." So he became a teacher. Then he became dreadfully ill, what I think is osteomyelitis, survives that. Then he's told he needs to have a wife, so he goes off and he finds a wife and gets married. Then he goes into bankruptcy as a teacher, and finally in 1837, so that's 20 years after his conversion, he makes it as a missionary, and he's made one of the Port Phillip Protectorates. Not quite a missionary, but they essentially were de facto missionaries, even though they were supposed to be teachers of Aborigines, etc. The sad thing is that he gets here, he goes up to the Goulburn River, up Benalla Way in 1837, and he suffers extreme culture shock. And we have his diary, it's down in the State Library, you can go and read it. He suffers incredible culture shock because Aboriginal culture is just so different from what he imagines. And of course, being an evangelical, he's appalled by the nakedness before him. Just that alone is enough to send him into a paroxysm of grief. But there's also the difficulties of communication. You know, he's wanted to save souls for 20 years and he can't talk to these people. And then his wife becomes ill. Then she goes into depression because her 5th child has died. And within less than 2 years, he's writing in despair, "I'm utterly tired of the situation in general and hesitate to believe that my being here is the result of providence." So he starts to doubt his very mission. He's had no conversions. He's up there on his own. There's no chapel community to support him. And it's actually a very pathetic story. He resigns from this life's work and he goes down and becomes a Methodist churchman up in North Melbourne, Coburg Way. So to sort of give a bit of an overview about missions in Australia, we see that they don't get started till the 1820s, 1830s. So at quite a late start. You know, the convict colony is a very irreligious place. There's about 2 clergymen in the first 30 years of the convict colony. And it's only in the 1820s that missionary initiatives start. And many of them don't last very long. 5, 10 years is often how long these first missionaries last. And we've got to ask why this is so. Well, they're coming into a very hostile environment of a convict colony. No one's particularly interested in evangelical religion. The convicts haven't got a great reputation for going to church or being very religious. And also the settlers are often similar, although there were some deeply religious settlers. And of course, they aren't getting anywhere in those early years with the Aborigines. They seem to be quite uncooperative. And I think that the way they view Aboriginal people themselves, they think that they're degraded. The history they see is that everyone was descended from the one creation, but after the flood and the dispersal of the humans, some groups of humans chose not to grow up in the sight of God, and so they became degraded. And this is how they explain savagery. So they believed in monogenesis, there was one creation, but certain peoples over the last 5,000 or 6,000 years had become degraded. And so this is why they often had a dim view of their so-called fellow humans. And Reverend Marsden, he was one of the only 2 clergymen in the early colony, and he believed that it was no use doing missionary work amongst Aborigines, and he put all his efforts into the Maori in New Zealand. And so there's a whole context of settler pessimism about Aboriginal people as slowly vanishing. And so often a lot of the missionary societies thought that they would put their efforts into greener fields like the Pacific Islands and in other parts. And Australia didn't have that sort of strong missionary tradition. I mean, Bolin, who's written about such things, said that there was a belief that one of the apostles had made it to India, and there was this early Christian tradition in India that could be worked on, but there were no such mythologies about Australia as a land of promise. So how do we sum up their efforts? They certainly, if you look at the case against missionaries, and a lot of people have written, you know, very negative views of of missions and what they were trying to do, you know, they say, well, they're inherently part of the colonial effort. You know, the cross follows the flag, or sometimes the flag follows the cross. And certainly the missions themselves were often agents of government, and they often appropriated Aboriginal land by setting up a mission which they believed they owned, not the local Aborigines. So they were into dispossessing in many ways, just like settlers. Some of them were seeking souls like prizes. You know, the evangelicals often added up how many people they can convert. And of course China was the great field because there were just millions and millions of people to convert. But they're often very interested in the tally of conversions. And many of them, if you read their missionary journals, because they believe that savages are degraded people, they have very derogatory views of Aboriginal people. You think, gee, these don't read like very Christian people, what they're saying they're savages, etc., etc. And we need to remember that the missionaries were bearers not only of Christian ideas, but of European ideas. They were cultural bearers as well as bearers of Christian ideas. But on the other hand, you know, we must remember that there are things that can be said for missionaries. For instance, some of them were great advocates, as I've talked about Threlkeld, who wrote to the government continually saying there are outrages on the frontier that need to be stopped. People are being extirpated, exterminated on the frontier. We need to do something about it. Others created sanctuaries for Aboriginal people in very tough frontier conditions where they might get a breathing space. Certainly, missionaries made great self-sacrifices. We can sit back and say, oh, you know, look what they were doing to Aboriginal people and trying to change them and whatever. But at least they were a few Europeans at the time who were trying to do something for Aboriginal people. Of course, it was mixed up with wanting to change them and wanting them to become like us, but they were actually sacrificing their lives, sometimes over 10 or 20 years, in a way that other people were not prepared to do. They certainly, at that time, generally contested the settlers' views. They never doubted that Aboriginal people were people and could be uplifted and saved and changed. And the other thing that's interesting is a lot of Aboriginal people today are using their diaries to find out so much about their own people 100, 150 years ago, because all the missionaries kept mission diaries. That was part of what they had to do, and they often wrote very interesting observations of Aboriginal people and how they were interacting with them, recorded Aboriginal culture. So much more would have been lost culturally if missionaries hadn't been there. But let's look now at what Aboriginal responses to the missionaries were. And here you could take the case of the Loddon Protectorate, one of the stations of the Port Phillip Protectorate, which was operating in the 1840s. And a man called Edward Stone Parker was the protector there, and he worked amongst the Dja Dja Wurrung people. And he got on with them very well. He certainly wrote about them as savages and was sort of a bit amazed by some of the things they did. But he also wrote with compassion and worked with those people not only to 1849, but once the protectorate was closed, he bought a farm nearby, and a lot of those people kept working for him for the next 5 or so years. And he argued that their labour would make the land that they were on theirs if they worked it hard. And he gave them a sense of a future. I think he did believe that in the end the whole enterprise was an evangelical failure because he couldn't produce any converts, although he kept on saying, you know, I can see glimmers of hope in some of the young people, and they come along to the Bible lessons and they look interested, but it never really happened for him. But certainly I think some of the men did try to be independent farmers after the protectorate folded in 1849, and for a few years they did make farming efforts. So perhaps his efforts to civilise and make them settle down and to become farmers was more successful in his effort to make them into Christians. And maybe we think, well, possibly what was going on here? Were they using the protectorate? Were they just being rice Christians, hanging around to see what they could get out of it? So that Aboriginal people, were they accommodating themselves to missions and missionaries to try and eke out a way of surviving in a difficult situation? Well, let's look at this is just to show you some of the missions that were formed in early Victoria. There were a few efforts in the 1830s, and then more efforts at Lake Boga, up on the Murray, Yelter in the Wimmera, Ebenezer, and Lake Tyers down in Gippsland. They were all started in the 1850s. Now, how did Aboriginal people respond to this? I think these missions of the 1850s again came from the evangelical impulse and the humanitarian impulse, and the whole effort was led by Thomas McCombie, who was a member of the Legislative Council and a journalist, and he'd written a history of Victoria and was very aware of the situation on the frontier and what had happened in the 1830s and 40s, and he led a Legislative Council inquiry which was twofold, in the sense that McCombie was a strong believer in the notion of progress, and European society must take over this land. It was destined to be so. But he also was concerned for the remnants he saw before him, and he said there was a sacred duty to do something for Aboriginal people. So he got a society that was unconcerned for 10 years with Aboriginal people. He got them going and eventually formed a central board of reserves and a reserve and mission system in 1860, which he said would help protect Aboriginal people. Now, how do we sort of understand these reserves and missions? People have had varying responses to them. Michael Christie, who wrote a book in the 1970s, said that the missions were like total institutions, using Irvin Goffman, the sociologist's modelling of total institutions as places of control where the inmates were under the control of the staff, and they had to do what the staff determined. Bain Atwood, who's written more recently of missions, talks about the way the missionaries tried to control space and time. They tried to regularise the day, much in the way, you know, that John Wesley regularised his day through his diary. They tried to regularise Aboriginal lives by having every hour of the day either devoted to tuition or to Christian education or to work or to rest. And he argued that through this use of time and also space, having children placed into dormitories, separated from parents, etc., you would shape the outcomes and that you would create compliant Aboriginal people. And he says that the seeds of oppression came to lie within Aborigines who were indoctrinated into this way of living and thinking. That the seeds of oppression were within as well as without. But I think that leaves out Aboriginal choice. And on the missions, something is happening. While ever the early missions don't meet with much success, by the 1860s and 70s, a lot of Aboriginal people, I think, are choosing to become Christian. They're not ceasing to become Aboriginal, but they're choosing to embrace Christianity. And I guess we need to ask why that's so. Whether it's a pragmatism or a new spirituality or perhaps even an emancipation. But certainly they were becoming, as they call themselves, settled down Christians. They had become farmers on these reserves, and they were embracing Christianity. So let's look at just 3 case studies to finish off. One of them was the case of Thomas Bungalini, and maybe we could call this pragmatic conversion. Thomas was brought in with his family after a very curious incident where some people thought in the 1840s they'd seen a white woman on the frontier in Gippsland, captured by the blacks. And this became a great nightly enterprise. There were 3 or 4 expeditions were sent out by the gentlemen of Melbourne to save this fair damsel from the distress of living amongst the blacks. And Julie Carr, who's in our administration, has written a book about this, and it's very interesting. Thomas Bungalini was brought in as the son of the man who thought to know about this, and he was brought in. Now, the father died, and the mother and the 2 children were then sent to the Merri Creek School, which was a school for young Aboriginal children in the 1840s. When the school broke up about 1849-50, Thomas and his brother Harry were taken in by a man called Hinkins, who was a school teacher in Essendon. They were baptised up at the Coburg Anglican Church. You can see on Sydney Road to this day with the spire and the Bluestone Church. And they were taken to Hinkins School, where they were taught to become just like other young settlers' children. When the governor arrived, Hinkins drove them to meet the governor in a cart all decked up in white suits, and they waved patriotic banners, and the governor even stopped to talk to them. In the mid-1850s, Harry Bungalini, Thomas's brother, dies. Thomas, I think, goes into great mourning. He's lost his parents. He was supposed to go with the school teachers of the Merri Creek School to Tasmania, but they left him behind. Then he was with Hinkins, so he had 3 different parents. He'd lost his brother, his only other person in the world that he was related to that he knew of. And he gets a bit out of control. He starts going a bit wild. He starts throwing tantrums and breaking things. And eventually he's put on the SS Victoria, which is a training ship for wayward boys. And there he's shaped up by the military discipline on the ship. And about this time, Harry makes 3 denials of his Aboriginality. The first time is when he's washing his hands with Mr. Hinkins, who he called father, and he said, "Father, are not my hands becoming whiter?" And then when he was on the ship, he insisted on telling the other boys on the SS Victoria that his parents were white and they were coming to come and see him tomorrow. And of course the Hinkins were white, but not his natural parents. And the third time, when I think it was Mr. Hinkins suggested maybe Thomas, there's a young Aboriginal girl on a station in southern New South Wales who's a Christian and she reads and writes beautifully, perhaps she would make a wonderful wife for you. And Thomas says, "What? Me marry a black woman?" So that he had, I think, been assimilated into thinking as a European in this way. And he joins the Oddfellows Society, which is mainstream colonial self-improving society, the Oddfellows, and he gives a speech to the Oddfellows at Essendon where he's roundly applauded for the aplomb of his speech, and he says he hopes that many other Aboriginal people will become Oddfellows just like him. And then he dies within a few months of becoming an Oddfellow. I don't think it killed him. I think he died from an influenza or something. So that Harry is a young boy taken out of his culture, and he pragmatically survives with the family he's fostered into, and the only way that he can make his way in the world is to go with the flow. There's also the case of Nathaniel Pepper, and I think he's a case of a true spiritual conversion. Nathaniel Pepper is a man of the Watchabaluk up in the Wimmera region. He grows up in the 1840s amidst the confusion of the frontier and the culture of violence and terror operating on the frontier. And then as a young man, about 20, when the Ebenezer mission has started in the 1850s, he goes into the mission and adopts the mission and lives there. And a very interesting thing happens when he and some of the other boys are being talked to by a man called Hagenau, who's a Moravian missionary, and he's not making much headway with these young boys, and he decides to read them a story, the story of Willie Wimmera, that was written down in a book that Hagenau have. Now the story of Willie Wimmera is of a young boy who was picked up by a settler after his mother was shot. He was taken to Adelaide, brought up by Reverend Chase, and then taken to England, where he makes a conversion to Christianity and then has a disease which he dies, and on his deathbed he utters Christian sentiments. Now it's a great Christian story of conversion and a Christian death. And so he decides to read this story, and when he finishes reading, the boys listening are stunned, and they start crying, and they say, that story of Willie Wimmera, he is one of us. His mother was killed beside that tree over there. And the man called Ellerman, who had actually fired the shot that killed the mother, was so remorseful that he decided to donate the land to start the Ebenezer mission. And it's at that moment that there's everything clicks for the mission. The young boys see a connection with the mission and with Willie Wimmera. And so Nathaniel Pepper starts asking to be converted and to be baptised. And first the missionaries don't want to do it. They don't think he's sincere. But through the talk, and you can read in their diaries what he's saying to them, he says things like, and he did this for me, which is what the evangelicals say about the crucifixion, that this person, Jesus, did this for them personally. And so Nathaniel, I think, makes a genuine conversion. He asks to be baptised. There's great celebrations because it seemed to be the first victory in Victoria. There were a couple of other conversions, but it's the first big one. And the thing was that Nathaniel agrees to leave his home country, travels to Gippsland with Hagenau, where he lives the rest of his life, and he does missionising amongst the Aborigines. So he becomes a preacher to the Aborigines before his own death at Rumiak in Gippsland. So this, I think, is a true spiritual conversion. And the final case is the case of William Barrack. William Barrack, as a boy, witnessed the signing of the Batman Treaty down by the wherever it was, the Darebin Creek, the Merry Creek, the Yarra, you choose. Historians don't know. But he was a young boy then. He was schooled in the government mission school. He joined the native police, became a native policeman. And then in the 1850s, he meets a man called John Green and his wife Mary, who are Scottish immigrants who go up to the orchard area just out near Ringwood, and they start preaching to people, including Aboriginal people, and he converts William Barrack, and together those two form the Aboriginal settlement at Corranderk, which the government had been trying to find them a place. They'd been kicked off a few places, and eventually the Aborigines with Green find their own place to form a reserve at Corranderk. And there they become Christian farmers, and Green is so important in allowing the Aboriginal people to choose how they want to live their life. They have their own court system, and they invent the rules about good behaviour. He lets them organise the work details because he believes in their skills. He believes they're brothers to him, not people under him. And they become very successful farmers, and just about all of them embrace Christianity because, I think, of Green's influence. And eventually Barrack becomes so important in the fight to keep that Aboriginal reserve, because by the 1880s the government's wanting to break up all the reserves, kick off Aboriginal people and absorb them, the the 19th century word for assimilation, absorbed them into the community. And Barrack leads his people in political struggles, marches on Melbourne, talking to newspapers, lobbying Parliament, lobbying the governor. And partly he does that because I think he's got some of the skills to do that. He's learnt that through embracing farming, embracing Christianity, but he still remains Aboriginal because in his later life, Barrack starts painting for the first time. And a lot of his paintings now you can see in Federation Square. And he remembers things he saw as a boy, and they're truly Aboriginal paintings in an Aboriginal style. So he's so solidly an Aboriginal man, and yet he's become also a Christian. So he's formed a syncretic blending of these two great traditions. And probably Aboriginal people, because of their great spirituality, were attracted maybe to Christianity, because with their own religious practices and rituals not able to be always followed now, there was the offer of this other way of being spiritual. So I'll leave that there for you to think about, and we'll have a short break, and I want to show you about 20 minutes of the second part of Women of the Sun.